I say interfacial, I um, I'm talking about the fact that we're looking at the human world and how it interfaces with this world of plants, right? So it's very much relational, looking at the relationships between plants and people in different geographic contexts. All right. So as such, it's drawing from a variety of fields. So geography and a number of others. You could even get into. It's also been called the science of survival. So, because each of us has a direct relationship and dependence on plants in a lot of different ways, right? Whether it's for food, whether it's for medicine, whether it's for the houses we're living in, we all have a very important connection to plant life, right? And it's also this idea that by investigating the way that local peoples all over the world have sustained themselves through evolutionary time with plants, it can inform us about ways that we might also survive into the future, right? In a time of compounding crises in a lot of different ways, whether it be ecological. So this ethnobotanical knowledge, the knowledge that people have about plants, is an important manifestation of what we call biocultural diversity. So this is the concept of an intimate link between biological, cultural, and linguistic diversity. So this idea that human culture is very much at a very foundational level built upon these relationships with plants, animals, and other organisms in the environment. And so having a lot of geographical basis to it, it creates an interactive and emergent form of diversity on which human culture diversifies, depending on the plants and animals in the environment. So languages are also an important manifestation of biocultural diversity. So right now in the world, there's a little over 7,000 languages spoken, depending on who you're talking to. And nearly half are endangered. So that means within the next generation, there's going to be no native speakers of that language. So we're seeing quite an erosion of this aspect of human culture currently as well. Ways of conserving biocultural diversity include documenting it, right? So like with a lot of biodiversity, for example, in order to know what we stand to lose, we have to document what we've got, right? So this involves going out in the field and finding out what people know, in this case, about plants. And then also using that information, trying to discover ways of preserving and even promoting that traditional knowledge and lifestyles in order to preserve that body of knowledge into the future. So a little bit about Georgia and the Caucasus region, in case anybody isn't familiar. Has anyone been? Has anyone had the opportunity to visit? Okay, well, hopefully you will someday. It's a very beautiful region and one that I think is quite amazing for a lot of reasons. So Georgia is part of the Caucasus biodiversity hotspot. So it's one of these areas of the planet where there is a lot of endemism in terms of plants and animals and a lot of diversity in vascular plants. The country of Georgia itself is very diverse botanically. So it's got over 4,000 vascular plant species and 260 national endemics. So those are plants that are found only within the country of Georgia. Georgia here is roughly the size of South Carolina as if you're from the States and want a kind of a basis of comparison. So quite a lot of diversity in a relatively limited geographic extent. Also there, part of what's driving this diversity is a lot of diversity in landforms and topography. Okay, so it's a very mountainous region of the world. So in the country of Georgia, again, you find 12 climate zones ranging from humid subtropical here at the, let me see if my laser pointer will work. That's okay. At the western edge of the country, one of the, we'll talk about it here in a sec, but one of the most precipitation in the world's temperate zones are to be found here. So ranging from humid subtropical at the coast up to alpine tundra, and then in the eastern part, continental high desert environments. So quite a lot of complexity in climate as well. And it's also ethno-linguistically different. Okay, so human cultural groups oftentimes are defined or define themselves through language. So this is an important aspect of this this culture nature connection. So in the Caucasus region, there's over 50 languages spoken, and in Georgia itself, in addition to the Georgian language, which is part of an endemic language family called the South Caucasian language family. There's other related languages like Swan and Laz, and then also other Indo-European languages like Armenian and Ossetian, and a number of other other sociolinguistic groups within Georgia. So we see a lot of variation in plant use and a strong tradition of plant use in Georgia, but it's facing erosion for a number of reasons. So like in our vignette at the beginning of the talk, part of what's causing this erosion of traditional plant use knowledge, ethnobotanical knowledge, is these economic changes within the country that see a lot of younger people, especially traveling from rural contexts and moving either to the city, urban areas within Georgia, or abroad entirely as a way of gaining better economic fortune. And so when this happens, you're getting the breaking of intergenerational linkages that really are the foundation of passing along a lot of this traditional knowledge down. And there's some evidence here that high elevations in the Caucasus can function somewhat as what are termed by some researchers as biocultural refugia, or areas that preserve both unique plant life and traditional ecological knowledge. So we might be familiar with the concept of biological refugia. Yeah, so these geographic areas on the planet that through aspects of their climate and through their geologic history are able to maintain a suite of plants and animals that were formerly more widespread. They're able to maintain them through geologic time. So we'll talk about one of these in a second. But there's this idea, but the idea of biocultural refugia is this idea that there's areas of the planet that are going to help to retain some of this biocultural knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge through features of the landscape and social conditions. So just real quickly to talk a little bit about the vegetation of Georgia. Again, you see there's quite a bit of complexity, and a lot of it is driven by, again, topographic and mountain chains. So there's an east-west divide in which we see a lot of mediating influence from the Black Sea here, leading to a warmer and wetter climate in the western half of Georgia. And then there's a transverse ridge of mountains, low-lying ridge, that connects the Lesser Caucasus here at the south to the Greater Caucasus. And this causes a rain shadow effect, causing the eastern part of the country to be much more continentally climate influenced. Okay, so you have a lot more variations in high and low temperatures. And the climate gets progressively drier as you go from west to the left part of the picture there to the east. And then in some of these areas, in the mountains, we can see evidence of how the social and ecological picture has changed in the past few decades. So in this mountain region from the Greater Caucasus, you can see in the middle here some striations on the mountainside. And these striations are the remnants of areas that were formerly terraced. Okay, so farmers and people living in this village formerly cut the hillsides into steps like you might see or be familiar with in Southeast Asia, and use them to raise cereal crops. But this has since lapsed and fallen into disuse as the population has decreased in these areas, and also changes to the subsistence patterns. So a lot more influence of connectivity to the outside world, for example, and a lot more ease of getting food, things like processed grain and flour to this area has led to these changes. So what am I trying to do in Adjara here? So some of the research questions from this project include looking at the ways that traditional lifestyles like pastoralism support and also generate plant use knowledge, right? So this idea that different lifestyles are going to be generative of plant use knowledge in different ways. Also look at how ethnobotanical knowledge can be integrated into biocultural conservation initiatives in Adjara. Okay, so if we're concerned about the erosion of some of these bodies of knowledge, how can we use the data we're collecting to really try to bolster it? Finally, and just to touch upon this, won't have too much time to talk about it today, but I'm also interested in looking at how spatial analyses can be used to assess Upper Adjara's status as a biocultural refugium. Okay, so how can we look at the sort of distribution of knowledge on the landscape and use spatial analyses to identify areas that might have features of these biocultural refugia within them. So this requires, again, this first step of documenting ethnobotanical knowledge in these contexts. Okay, so going out, talking with people, using ethnographic interviews, and finding out what they know about plants. Secondly, look at how land use and vegetation around some of these sampling sites, so sampling sites would be the villages where people live, basically, how that affects patterns of plant use. So the plants that people are using, how this sort of body of knowledge is impacted by what's going on in the environments around them. And finally, assessing Upper Adjara's status as a possible biocultural refugium. So to talk more about the region that I'm, where I did a lot of field work for this project, the region of Adjara here in the southwestern part of the country. So this is on the border with Turkey to the south here, and then the Black Sea, the west. So Adjara, which can be translated in different ways into, transliterated in different ways into English. This is the convention I'm using. But it's a semi-autonomous region in southwestern Georgia, with a mild climate, again, mediated by that proximity to the ocean, right? So that adjacency to the sea is helping to moderate some of these extremes of highs and low temperatures. And it's got a unique history for the country of Georgia. So Adjara, in the past, from a period from the mid 1600s to the late 1800s, was what's called the suzerainty of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so while most of Georgia during this period of time was part of the Russian Empire, this particular region, Adjara, was part of the Ottoman Empire. And following the transfer of Adjara from the Ottoman Empire to the Russian Empire, and then in the Soviet time period, it became an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic within Georgia, okay? And part of this is the reason for this autonomous and now semi-autonomous status was differences in religion. Okay, so while this was a possession of the Ottoman Empire, a lot of the folks in this case converted to Islam, which is a different condition than most Georgians who espouse Orthodox Christianity. So much so that when you're going out here and talking to people and asking them about their religious identity, they'll say things like, "Oh, well, I'm Muslim, but you know, it's okay. I'm Georgian too," which to the outsider, you know, these things are, you know, both these things can be possible, but from the insider perspective of the culture, there's such a deep tie between Georgianness in a way and Orthodox Christianity that there's a tension here in this region in religious identity. Also, it's hard to see on this, but this vegetation of Western Georgia is part of what's called the Colchic Relictual Forest. And so this is one of these refugia floras. Okay, so this was an area that during the last glacial maximum, in which a lot of these upper areas in the Caucasus region and the Northern Hemisphere were under ice, this place was ice-free. And so you have survival of a lot of species and diversity, biological diversity there, that was formerly more widespread, that now is only found in this strip kind of along the Black Sea, which is quite interesting. And gives a lot of potential for unique relationships with plant-human relationships. Here's some satellite imagery. So again, we have the largest city here, Batumi, on the coast, and Adjara National Park on the western part of Adjara is one of the rainiest places in the temperate zone. So over 400 centimeters of rain. So something on par with like the Olympic Peninsula in the Northwest United States, as an example. So here you go from sea level at the Black Sea to the eastern part of Adjara, which is about 10,000 feet. And this region of Adjara is only about the size of Rhode Island. Okay, so if you can imagine, you had the opportunity to visit Rhode Island, driving from the coast to the other end of it, and you go up almost 10,000 feet in elevation, you get an idea of what the landscape is like a bit. And so, again, this real moderating effect of the sea, the proximity to the sea, allows for what's been described as by some geographers as a subtropical climate. It's kind of like the Florida of Georgia. Okay, so in areas along the coast here, it's not too uncommon to see things like banana plants, to see things like large stands of bamboo, etc. So a flora that really is different from what we might expect from the typical, our typical ideas of the post-Soviet world. So going up a little bit in elevation now, we're going to look at kind of snapshots from different areas within Adjara, going from mostly west to east. As we go up, you have these Colchic mixed hardwood forests. And it's very typical to see this kind of human inhabitation, these houses kind of sprinkled on these hillsides as the mountains kind of just rise up right away from the sea. And again, very mild climate, allowing for the growth of things like corn and beans and even tobacco in some regions or some areas of Adjara. A little bit higher, you start getting into these mixed coniferous hardwood forests. Most of these are spruce, so Picea normandiana, mixed hardwood forests, and still having permanently occupied villages, oftentimes at these kind of upper middle elevations. And you see their haystacks of folks laying up hay for their herds. Because in this region, there is a lot of a strong tradition of pastoralism, mostly based around cows. So Bos taurus domesticus, the humble and familiar cow to us. But we see here some interesting things in the uppermost, highest elevation regions of Adjara. So you'll note on the right side of the picture here how closely cropped a lot of the vegetation is. The cows do a job as they're out eating and running these hillsides. And then on the left, you see a paddock area where they've been excluded, and you can see the tremendous diversity within that paddock. So indeed, some of the most biodiverse landscapes, ecosystems in this landscape are these higher elevation grassland ecosystems. You also note there on the left, the presence of trees, and then eventually they kind of start fading out to the right as you might be able to make out like a village in the distance there. So an important and interesting thing to note is most of these upper elevation grasslands are actually below physiological tree line. So trees and forests could be growing here, but through centuries of human use and pastoralism, folks have cut down a lot of the timber for their houses and for cooking and different uses. And then these open now meadow pasture environments are maintained through continuous grazing. So you have the spread and the maintenance of anthropogenic environments that are more diverse than what we would think of as a less disturbed ecosystem in this context. So transhuman pastoralism is a term for a subsistence style in which people are moving around the landscape from season to season with their herds and utilizing different resources on the environment. So in the case of Adjara, you have what's called vertical transhumance. So people are moving from lower elevations in the wintertime, and then once the snow comes off in the mountains, they move with their herds up to these seasonally occupied mountain villages, spend the summer grazing the cattle on these grasslands. And then once the snow starts to fly, they'll move them back down again to the permanently occupied villages at lower elevations. And these houses are actually quite interesting the way they're set up. So you'll note that they're two level. So there's a lower level here and an upper level up top. And the lower level functions basically as a barn. So that's where the small herd of cattle will live. Typically, most 10 to a dozen living there. And then the folks, the people will live on the second layer above. And you can see the way this is set up is there's a kind of a garden area below the house here. And the barn, it can be mucked out basically, and the manure from the cows is used to fertilize these garden areas below the houses. So it's quite an interesting setup, the way that folks have the houses built in this region. And also you'll note, and something I've noticed traveling this region is oftentimes upslope of the houses themselves will be denuded of wood, of trees. So there'll often be bare mountains above the houses, and then below is where you'll start seeing the trees again. And part of this is when folks were using trees to actively build homes in this area, I think it's just a lot easier to take those logs and things and bring them down from uphill and pull them up from downhill. So it's quite interesting history of plant use in that regard. And so transhumance is still an actively practiced and vital kind of subsistence pattern in this area, but it's also one that we're starting to see some areas where it's falling into disuse. So you see here this kind of dilapidated home as younger people again begin turning away from this lifestyle and looking to get more integrated into different economic sectors in urban areas. So how do we do this research? It starts oftentimes with what's called a free list. So you go out and you find people, talk to people in these villages, and you basically ask, do you know anything about plants? And then hopefully they'll say yes. If they say no, they'll probably know someone who does. And then you can go visit that person. And then you start creating this list, asking them about plants that they're familiar with. And then going through that list and asking them about ones that they might use for food, medicine, or other uses. And then you can start doing what's called a semi-structured interview. So this is semi-structured in that it does have some guardrails and that we're looking at certain knowledge domains, but it also gives us the flexibility to go and talk about, chase down particular notes of interest that the project participant might note without being too confined narrowly to a structure. And sometimes we can also engage in what are called walking interviews, which is a really nice way of getting to know plants in the area when a project participant who might have some free time will take you around and point out the plants that they use and they know about. And we find more project participants by utilizing what's known as snowball sampling. So this is where you find one person and then you might ask that person at the end of the interview, do you know anybody else who knows about plants? And then they mention somebody else, you go talk to them, and gradually your snowball of project participants gets bigger and bigger. Very importantly here, I was aided in simultaneous translation of participant responses by some co-researchers of mine. You can see them working here, taking good notes. Quite helpful because while I do speak a bit of Georgian, the particular kind of vocabularies that's associated with a lot of plant use, as well as the stronger dialects that you get in a lot of rural areas, makes it difficult for even native speakers sometimes to fully understand what folks are talking about. So I did have the benefit and the joy of working with local Georgian graduate students as co-researchers. And so we documented plant use in a number of different areas. So edible plants, medicinal plants, ones used for building material, agrobiodiversity in local gardens. So looking at the plants and different varieties of plants that people are growing. Ethnoveterinary uses. So plants that folks use when their animals are sick, for example. And then also a smattering of ethnomycological uses. So looking at mushrooms that are used for food or medicine in this context. And part of this involved the collection of herbarium specimens. So of course, when somebody names a plant and its uses or their ideas about this plant, it's really essential in a lot of cases to be able to identify the specific biological species they're talking about, right? Because two people might call the same plant two different things, or they might use the same term for two different plants. So in this way, by collecting herbarium specimens, you're able to positively associate these folk uses and folk names with a particular biological species. And so at the same time, we're, when possible, collecting seeds, taking photos, taking habitat notes, etc. So from fieldwork extending back to 2016, the dark ages, we had a number of interviews, 89 interviews in 70 localities, so 70 different villages throughout Adjara. And you see the kind of elevation breakdowns here. So tried as best as possible to get a good snapshot of what was happening in the different elevational gradients within Adjara. And these roughly, these elevation cutoffs roughly map onto distinctive vegetation zones within the region. So from these almost 90 interviews, we talked with 115 people, 64 of which were female and 51 of which were male. And the age range ranged from 18 to 83, okay? And you'll note that the average ages skew a bit older. And this is pretty common with something you find when talking to people who are either self-identified experts about plants or who whose neighbors identify them as experts. They tend to be a bit older because they've had a longer time to live in these environments and learn about the different relationships with plants. So we found 162 species cited by project participants and 128 different genera from 72 different plant families. And some of the most cited families in this case are ones we're probably familiar with. Okay, so the Rosaceae, for example, the roses, having 21 species of 9 different genera. And then the Asteraceae, or the sunflower family, and the Apiaceae, or the carrot family. So all very important families in terms of human relationships, right? We have a lot of different food and medicinal plants that come from these families. So we got to, well, enjoying collecting good data, also enjoy some of the interesting uses of plants in terms of traditional foods. So things like a dish called hapi shorba, which is kind of a squash and corn chowder that includes leaves of the green leaves of a plant that we'll talk about here in a second. But it was quite interesting seeing some of this food. For example, when we sat at this meal and enjoyed this dish, one of the gentlemen who sat with us said that he loved this food and it had been a number of years since he had it because people had kind of stopped making it. So you're seeing like a change in foodways as well as some of this knowledge gets lost. Also interesting uses of plants include on the left there, immature pine cones used as a preserve, basically. So you kind of cook them in a reduction of sugar in like a syrup and then can them, and they're actually quite tasty. I mean, they sort of have a citrusy kind of vibe. And then on the right here, we see an Adjara woman engaged in a traditional cheese making activity. So a lot of the diet in some of these upper areas of Adjara is based around dairy. People don't tend to eat the cows or use them as a source of meat, but they're much more prone to use them as a source of milk and dairy products. So it's not unusual if to sit at a participant's house here and have them kind of set a little table for you, and it's things like they set out yogurt, sour cream, cheese, this dish called Burano, which is very nice. It's kind of like a local take on fondue, in which they melt cheese and clarified butter, and then you spread it on bread. I'm getting hungry just thinking about it, but a lot of it is based again around dairy. On the left there, you have a yogurt-like dish called matsoni, which is typically eaten and viewed as a very healthful food, topped with dried summer savory, or Cererea spicidura. And this is a very typical Georgian flavor. So if you get the chance to enjoy Georgian food ever, it will likely have the Cererea spicidura in it. And then there's some interesting other relationships with plants that we noticed. So that dish that I talked about, hapi shorba, before, that had the green leaves of the plant in it, is those green leaves are this species. So Bistorta officinalis, or what's called Dwalura in the local language. And it is eaten in the springtime as what the Georgians call a holly. So it's a diced and minced salad, usually of boiled green leaves and walnuts. And it's used as one of the first kind of green things that you kind of eat in the springtime that comes up. And so we noted folks in this context in Upper Adjara bringing this plant from the wild into their gardens and using it as a source of food, especially again in the springtime. So it's usually eaten when those leaves first come out. By the time the flowers come up like that and are mature, usually like with a lot of other leafy greens, they're not as good once they get a little bit more mature. So there it is, kind of in the wild. And we also documented a lot of local agrobiodiversity. So on the left, you see a turnip, and on the right, some different radishes. And in the middle, again, some of the areas in Middle Adjara are quite good for the growing of tobacco. So that's a tobacco. Couple shots of just these gardens again in Upper Adjara, and you can see they're quite diverse, and also might seem a little disorganized to our typical thought about a garden. So these are very much people are growing things in a polyculture, right? You might have a little patch for the different species, but oftentimes they're growing mixed together for different reasons. And in Upper Adjara, at least, you have folks mostly growing in these gardens potatoes as a main staple crop. So like in a lot of montane areas around the world, potatoes are a food of choice because they're a really good source of nutrients without a lot of with low processing time. Also, we noted an interesting diversity of plants that are used in the preparation of alcohol. So while Georgia has a very strong tradition of winemaking, due to the fact that this region in Adjara is so damp, and also a lot of it is high elevation in which grapes don't really grow well, what people tend to do is make a kind of brandy, so a distilled kind of liquor out of various fruits, including things like persimmons, wild plums. And an interesting one we noted was the use of the flowers from Robinia pseudoacacia, or the black locust tree, used as a source of sugar and flavor for one of these brandies. Which is interesting because this plant is considered an invasive species in Georgia. So its native range is a fairly limited and spotty area in eastern North America, but it's since spread out nationally across the United States. And in this context is considered an invasive species, but folks are using it again as a source of alcohol. Some of the snapshots of plants and material culture include things like baskets and housing. And here we see construction of one of these houses. Ethnoveterinary uses of plants are very important and might be viewed as an endangered knowledge domain, because when queried, folks often said that they knew or their parents may have used plants as ways to treat their cows, for example, but they were much more prone to using Western biomedicine for their herds these days. So things like Sambucus ebulis, which is a relative of elderberry, is used to treat kidney infections. And then Veratrum album, which is called chama in the local language, which literally means poison, is used as a delousing agent. So folks will make like a concentrated tea and spread that on their cows as a way of getting rid of parasites. So real quick, I'm gonna have to speed run because I'm just running short of time here. An interesting thing we noted was a good chunk of participants that we talked to noted cures for rickets, which is a childhood disease that is excuse me. it's related to mineralization problems in the bones. So it was interesting to note that people were noting a lot of cures for this, including most of the time it would entail bathing the child in what's called a naharshi, or a kind of strong tea, again, of these plants. And folks were noting that there was this specific basis in which folks were afflicted with the disease that was caused by what's called the evil eye. So this idea that other folks in the community are looking at you jealously or with some sort of jealous aspect to them. And this would manifest as disease either within you or your loved ones. And so children are thought to be especially susceptible to this owing to their smaller size. And there's also a number of plants, medicinal plants, which have some kind of economic use as well. So for example, nego or Helichrysum arenarium, in addition to being used as in funerary rites and to beautify the home, are also used in many medicinal preparations. And there's a small market in which these flowers are dried and sold. Actually, we see here at the top of this, these are actually bags of nego. And this other plant, Caucasalia parviflora, which is one of these endemic plants to the region, is also widely gathered. And folks in this context don't use it themselves, but they will gather it in mass and sell it to herbalists who do. Then also the motsui, or the Caucasian whortleberry, has a bit of a market as well. And it's thought to be a very healthful plant and can aid in things like regulating blood sugar, which there's a bit of scientific evidence that this is true. And so we see a kind of push and pull of benefits and drawbacks of plants being used for economic purposes, not only in this context, but elsewhere. On one hand, this can help folks in rural areas diversify their income, right? And maintain their livelihoods in these areas. But on the other hand, that increased demand might also put increased pressure on these plant populations. So there's a real dance that you have to do in order to make sure that these plant populations are going to be maintained. So as I'm finishing up this project, working on some manuscripts related to the issues that I talked about today. And I'd like to return in 2026 to return some results from this. So visit these communities, let them know what we found, and also look at the possibility of initiating comparative studies with other transhuman populations in different areas of Georgia. So areas where you have the same vertical kind of movement of people seasonally, how does plant use play out in other geographic areas that are related? Because we really see the environment and lifestyles interacting in complex ways that are influencing plant use knowledge. And understanding these influences can help us to maintain traditional ecologic knowledge and the species on which it's based. So it's my hope that this research can be used to help support folks living in these local contexts and help preserve these bodies of knowledge on into the future. So just real quick, I would really like to acknowledge all the project participants that helped me out and talk to our group, my co-researchers as well, members of my committee and associates in Georgia, also UF School of Natural Resources and Environment. Thank you very much for some travel funding and different things. European Studies, as the Center for European Studies as well. And I might have time for one question, maybe, if anyone.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. There's a couple questions in the chat. One was a little bit back, and I think you've mentioned about invasive plants since that question was posted. But Monica asked, did you find differences in your results according to the gender of the participants?
Yeah, so this is something that's very, very interesting. There is a difference and apparent differences in knowledge about plants depending on gender. For example, women in this context oftentimes will be doing a lot of the caretaking of children. And so they will at least be citing those kinds of uses earlier on in the interview. So oftentimes men will also know these as well, but it won't be kind of front and center in the brain the way it is with women in some cases. Also differences in kind of culinary knowledge. So depending on who's cooking, they might have more ideas about edible plants, for example. Can I take a question from the crowd?
So, Bridget, actually on that some of the traditional dishes are no longer made. So I want to know what replaced.
Yeah, well, folks, because there's even in these pretty rural areas, which are quite remote, there might only be one or two sort of vans that come per day. Folks, because of the limited scale of the landscape, folks are able to access processed goods. So you're seeing a little more influence of that, right? Of folks buying pre-processed foods and bringing them in because it's like with us, right? Oftentimes, when I personally am eating more processed food just because I'm short on time, right? And so folks are busy in this context too. And so you see oftentimes more of these like pre-prepared kind of foods becoming more prominent.
I just wanted to ask about the structures of the houses. Is it because of the transparency? Is it because of economic status? Just
I think it's efficiency of materials. If I had to bet, because when you have a two-storied house, for example, you only need a single roof, right? Whereas if you had a house and then a barn, you would need roofs for both. And so I think part of it is just economics of material in this case. I think that's part of the reason why. And there's other regions of Georgia, for example, where you do see folks having two different structures, or they might be side by side, but it's a single unit rather than this two-story. Thanks.
Can I add one? What do you think are the main factors which influence the plant use knowledge? Like, is it like related to geographic isolation or elevation? Like, one of those factors maybe can be important.
Yeah, I think isolation has a lot to do with it. Both those things actually, because they're tied together, right? But I think it's kind of like the further you get out in the remote areas, the less access people will have for things like medicinal medicines, for example, store-bought medicines from like a pharmacy or something like that, right? So that's a big thing that's driving it. But yeah,
so would you say that in higher elevations, for instance, in this context, in this region, the people have like a greater knowledge about the plant use compared to lower elevations or like urban areas?
Yeah, I'd say on average, yes. But then even at lower elevations, it depends, because there's always those kind of like key people you talk to who know a lot, right? But what they know might be different, because oftentimes people are influenced by the plants that are around them in the environment, right? And those are the things that are coming through when I ask you about plants. If I ask you about plants here in Florida, for example, it's going to be different. We're going to get a different kind of suite of plants that y'all will be talking about than if I hold the same interview in like Tennessee or California or, Africa or something like that, right? So all these things have a very, there's a big geographic factor here. And it's really difficult oftentimes to tease these different influences apart.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing your this really, really interesting project. I really enjoyed learning about this. That's not a region of the world that I'm super familiar with, but I'm really glad to have learned about it today. So for everybody on Zoom, I've taken all of your attendance, and I think everybody probably had the sign-in sheet in class. Yeah, I hope everybody has a great week, and thank you all again for joining us today.
Thanks, y'all. Thank you. Can I stop sharing? Thanks, everybody. Oh, hey, how's it going?
Yeah.
Good to see you.
You too, you too.
What you been up to?
Not much. I'm actually I'm graduating this semester. My
Nice.